In the previous video, we have looked at how the government policies can affect the income level in the economy, given that we have a balance of payment which is perfectly mobile, with perfect capital mobility in our balance of payment, which would give us a horizontal line of balance of payment, which we have covered in the previous video. In this video and in the upcoming video, we'll focus on how does the market policies, how does the government policies can impact the market and impact the income level, given that we have imperfect capital mobility. So make sure that you have watched the previous video, otherwise you're not gonna understand a lot in this video anyway, because because the topic is a little bit complex, I won't be going through the basics all over again. So make sure you have watched the previous video before you can continue on with this one. And then there's one more disclaimer that you have to keep in mind. In some textbook, when they discuss imperfect capital mobilities, the curve for balance of payment, which is elastic or slightly flatter balance of payment curve, and the balance of payment curve which is inelastic, because if you think about it, we should have two situations when we are looking at imperfect mobility. A situation where the curve is elastic or a little bit flatter, and a situation where the curve is, let's call this elastic, let's call this inelastic, where the curve is little bit steeper. And in some textbook, they will represent both of those curves and analyze both of the curves and its effect in the market in the same diagram as I have sketched over here. Whereas in some textbook, they will analyze the cause and effect individually. However, if we analyze both the curves in the same diagram, the analysis can become very complex and the diagrams can become very sketchy very quickly. So just to keep things simple, I will analyze both the different elasticities in separate diagrams just so that we have a clear understanding. But if you find in some textbook that both of them analyzed together, do not freak out. It's the same identical analysis. It's just that the both diagrams are like squashed into the same one, if that makes sense. So with that disclaimer, let's start with our first situation where we have fixed exchange rate, and we have an expansionary monetary policy. And just like the previous video, whatever policies, whatever effects we're discussing for expansionary monetary policies, if the question or if the analysis is about contractionary monetary policy, all you have to do is inverse the logic and inverse everything that we discussed for expansionary monetary policy. So what's going to happen? We know from our basic understanding that when we have expansionary monetary policy, money supply is gonna increase, so money supply would go up. And when the money supply goes up, we know that our LM curve is gonna shift towards the right. The LM curve will shift towards the right. This is something that we know from our basic understanding, and this is going to give us a new equilibrium point. If the initial equilibrium point is y0, we will go from y0 all the way from y1, so our income in the economy would increase, and we would have a new equilibrium from E0 all the way to E1. So we'll go from E0 all the way to E1. Fine. So that is our basic understanding, and at the same time as the LM curve shifts towards the right, our interest rate would go from R0 to R1. This is something we basically understood from the previous analysis of the this is something that we also studied from our previous video, where the balance of payment line is a horizontal line, assuming that we have perfect capital mobility. So what is going to happen? In case of imperfect mobility, the analysis is exactly identical to that of perfect mobility. The government, in order to keep the balance of payment equal, meaning because this is a fixed exchange rate, the government will try to keep our balance of payment constant, meaning they will not allow the currency to depreciate. We know that in this situation, when we have an increase in money supply, when the interest rate drops, if this is below the balance of payment line, we would have a deficit. Any point in this case, E1 is below the balance of payment line, so this would be a deficit for the balance of payment. If any point is above the BP line, we would call that to be a surplus. In this situation, E0 is not a surplus, it's not a deficit, it's in the middle. However, when we move from E0 to E1, we move from E0 to E1. If you have a movement from E0 to E1, you will have a balance of payment deficit, and we know that whenever we have a balance of payment deficit, we are going to have a depreciation. Of the currency, and the government will not allow that to happen because this is a fixed exchange rate. So government is going to intervene in the market, and they will buy US dollars, and they will sell, sorry, my mistake, they will sell they are going to sell US dollars, or if they want, they don't have to do that, but generally countries would do that. They would sell the US dollar and they would buy their own currency, and this is gonna cause the MS, or the money supply in the foreign exchange market, to be reduced. So we would go back from LM1 all the way back to LM. So we would go back from LM1 to LM, and that is going to make our equilibrium from Y1 to Y0. All in all, there is no change. All in all, in monetary policies, even when we discuss imperfect market, we would have no change in the result for monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy. So we would call this policy ineffective. So we would say that monetary policy in a fixed exchange rate, if it's an imperfect market, would be an ineffective policy. And this is also true if we have elastic. So this is an elastic. So if I were to draw a curve, something like that. Now let's do it again. Let's say if I had a BP line, something like that. Let's say if this was my balance of payment line, and if we assume the balance of payment line to be inelastic, meaning a little bit more steeper, in the case of monetary policy, we would have the exact same analysis. There will be no difference. So for monetary policy, whether the BP is elastic or whether the BP is inelastic, all in all, we would have no change in our result. All in all, we would go from Y0 to Y1, and the government would intervene, and then we'll go from Y1 to Y0 again. So we would say that both policies, this policy is gonna be an ineffective. So we would say that this policy is ineffective for the economy to improve in its income. Now let's look at fiscal policy. Let me see if I can move over here. So what's gonna happen for fiscal policy? In diagram 1, we have a situation where the BP curve is elastic, meaning it's more flat, and in the second diagram we have a situation where the BP curve is more elastic. I mean, it is a little bit more steeper, more inelastic. So what's going to happen? As you can see over here, we know that when the government intervenes for fiscal policies, the government spending increases. When the government spending increases, we know that the IS curve will shift towards the right. So we would go from IS0, so ISG1, or you can call it IS1, doesn't really matter, and we would have a new equilibrium point from E0 all the way to E1, and at the same time, when the government spending increases, our interest rate would go from R0 to R1, something that we understand from our basic understanding. And all in all, our income would go from a Y0. However, there's one additional thing that we have to keep in mind. Because this is an elastic curve, meaning our BP line is flatter, any point below is going to be a deficit, any point above is going to be a surplus. E1 is above the BP line, so we are going to have a balance of payment surplus. Since we have a balance of payment surplus, the currency is going to appreciate. Since we have a point above the balance of payment line, the currency is going to appreciate. So initially we would have a movement from Y0 to Y1, but then the government is going to intervene because this is a fixed market. So the government is going to intervene and they will move the LM curve towards the right. So if I can see if I can draw that. They would move the LM curve towards the right by buying US dollars. The government would buy US dollar, they would buy US dollar, and they would sell their own currency. Let's say that their own currency is, let's just say that their currency is Chinese yuan. So they would sell yuan and they would buy US dollar. That's going to increase the supply for yuan in the market, increasing the LM curve, shifting the LM curve, and you would have a new equilibrium point. And let's say that that point is gonna be Y2. So we would go from Y0 to Y1, and then the government is going to intervene, and we are going to go from Y1 all the way to Y2 because of the government intervention. Now, why is the government intervening? Because we have to make sure in a fixed market our equilibrium point must lie on the BP line. Because this is a fixed market, the government intervenes and makes sure that the exchange rate price is constant and equal to the BP line. So as you can see that we have an increase in GDP from Y0 all the way to Y2. This policy is going to be very effective. This policy is going to be an effective policy. Now what's going to happen if our BP curve is inelastic? Our BP curve is more steeper. We would have the exact same analysis. However, there's one big difference. In the previous one, when we have the BP curve to be flatter, Then equilibrium point, meaning E1 is slightly towards the positive side, meaning E1 is on a surplus side. But over here we can see that E1 is below the BP line, so we are going to have a deficit below the BP line, meaning anything on the right of BP line or below the BP line is going to be a deficit. Anything above the BP line or left of BP line is going to be a surplus. Over here E1 is a deficit, meaning E1 equilibrium point. See if I can do that. So this point over here is in a deficit. So since we have a deficit, how would the government intervene? The government would intervene by reducing the money supply. How can the government do that? Exactly the inverse of what they're doing for when we have a surplus. The government is going to sell US dollar and they are going to buy their own currency so that they can reduce the supply for money of their currency in the exchange market. This will cause the LM curve to shift towards the right and reach a new equilibrium point. Let's just say that this point over here is point C. If I can draw a line, let's say this would be y2. So initially we go from y0 all the way to y1, then we retract a little bit back from Initially we go from y0 to y1 and then we retract a little bit back from y1 all the way to, let's say, y2. However, in both policies you will notice that we still have an improvement, meaning y2 is still slightly ahead of y0. So we would say that both policies are actually effective. However, fiscal policy, when we have a more flatter BP line, is going to be more effective than when we have a BP line which is slightly more inelastic. But the analysis is the same for both, except that when you have an inelastic BP line, we are in a deficit, whereas when you have a elastic BP line, meaning more flatter BP line, we are in a surplus.